The rooster crowed at 5 in the morning, and I could already see Patricia Henderson standing at the edge of my property line with her phone pointed at my chicken coop, like she was documenting a crime scene. This was the third morning in a row, and I knew exactly what was coming next. My name is Thomas Darrow, and I have lived on this 5-acre plot in rural Madison County, Tennessee, for the past 7 years, tending to the same land my grandfather worked back in the 1940s. What I did not know was that buying a house on grandfathered agricultural land would put me in the crosshairs of the most relentless HOA president in the entire state. I walked out onto my porch with my coffee, still wearing my work jeans and a flannel shirt. The air was crisp, typical for late October in Tennessee, and the leaves on the oak trees bordering my property had turned brilliant shades of orange and red. Patricia noticed me immediately and started marching across the grass toward my fence line, her perfectly styled blonde hair barely moving in the morning breeze. "Thomas Darrow, we need to talk about this situation right now," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through the morning calm. She was probably in her mid-50s, always dressed like she was about to attend a country club luncheon even at dawn. Today, she wore cream-colored slacks and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill. "Good morning to you too, Patricia," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. My 3 chickens were pecking around in their run, and my 2 goats, Hank and Dolly, were munching on hay near the small barn I had rebuilt last spring. "What seems to be the problem?" "You know exactly what the problem is," she snapped, waving her phone at me. "This is a residential neighborhood now. We have rules, regulations, and standards to maintain. Your farm animals are a direct violation of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA bylaws, Section 12, subsection 4, which explicitly prohibits livestock of any kind on residential properties." I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing and walked closer to the fence. "Patricia, I have explained this to you before. This property has been zoned for agricultural use since 1942. My grandfather raised cattle, pigs, and chickens on this exact land. The zoning never changed." "That is irrelevant," she said, her face flushing pink. "When Meadowbrook Estates was developed in 2018, all properties within the boundaries became subject to HOA regulations. You purchased your home in 2018, which means you agreed to those terms." "I bought this house in 2018, but this land was never part of the original HOA development," I countered, keeping my voice level. "My property existed long before your neighborhood was even planned. You can check the county records yourself." Patricia's jaw tightened. "I have already consulted with our HOA attorney. You will be receiving a formal cease and desist letter by the end of this week. If you do not remove these animals within 30 days, we will pursue legal action. This is your final warning." She turned on her heel and walked back toward the cluster of cookie-cutter homes that made up Meadowbrook Estates. The development had sprung up around my property like mushrooms after rain, transforming what used to be open farmland into a sprawling suburb of identical 2-story houses with manicured lawns and strict aesthetic guidelines. My 5 acres sat right in the middle of it all, a stubborn reminder of what the land used to be. I finished my coffee and headed out to feed the animals. Hank and Dolly trotted over to greet me, their tails wagging. I had raised them from kids, and they were as friendly as dogs. The chickens provided fresh eggs every morning, and I had been considering adding a couple of ducks to the mix. Now it looked like I would be fighting just to keep what I already had. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived. I signed for it and opened the envelope to find a 10-page document on official Meadowbrook Estates HOA letterhead. The language was dense and threatening, full of legal jargon about property values, community standards, and breach of contract. They were demanding I remove all livestock within 30 days or face fines of $500 per day, plus legal fees. At the bottom was Patricia Henderson's signature, along with that of the HOA attorney, a guy named Marcus Webb from a law firm in Nashville. I called my buddy Jake Morrison, who ran a small law practice in town. Jake and I had gone to high school together, and he had helped me with the property purchase back in 2018. "Jake, I need you to look at something for me." We met at his office that afternoon. Jake was a big guy, former linebacker for the University of Tennessee, now running a successful practice that mostly handled real estate and small business matters. He read through the HOA letter, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. "This is aggressive," he said finally, tossing the letter onto his desk. "They are not messing around, but I think they are also making a fundamental mistake." "What kind of mistake?" I asked. Jake pulled up his computer and started typing. "You said your property has been zoned agricultural since the 40s, right? And you never signed any HOA documents when you bought the place." "That is correct. The seller made it clear the property was not part of the HOA. It was one of the main reasons I bought it. I wanted space to keep animals and live without someone telling me what color I could paint my shutters." Jake nodded, clicking through county records. "Here we go. Your property, 5.2 acres at 4782 Old Mill Road, zoned agricultural residential since November 1942. Never changed. And look at this, the Meadowbrook Estates development was approved in 2016, but the plat map specifically excludes your parcel. You are not legally part of their HOA, so they cannot enforce their rules on me. Not only can they not enforce their rules, but if they try to sue you, they are going to lose badly, and you might have grounds for a harassment claim if they keep pushing." Jake leaned back in his chair, a grin spreading across his face. "Thomas, this is the kind of case that makes HOAs look ridiculous. They are so used to bullying homeowners that they did not even do basic due diligence. What should I do? Let me draft a response. I will cite the zoning records, the plat map, and make it clear that any further harassment will result in a countersuit. That should make them back off. And if it does not," Jake's grin widened, "then we go to court, and I get to embarrass them in front of a judge." I left Jake's office feeling better than I had in days. That evening, I was out in the yard fixing a section of fence when my neighbor from the east side, an older gentleman named Robert Chen, walked over. Robert had lived in the area for nearly 20 years, long before Meadowbrook Estates existed. "Evening, Thomas," he called out. "I heard Patricia has been giving you trouble." "You could say that," I replied, hammering a nail into a fence post. "She wants me to get rid of my animals." Robert shook his head. "That woman has been a menace since she moved in. She tried to tell me I needed to repaint my house because the color did not match the HOA-approved palette. I had to remind her that my property is also not part of the HOA. How did she react? About as well as you would expect. Threatened legal action, sent nasty letters, the whole 9 yards. But once I showed her the property records, she backed off. Well, mostly. She still glares at me whenever she drives past. We talked for a while longer, and Robert shared stories about the area before the development came in. His property had also been part of the original farming community, and he remembered when my grandfather used to sell fresh produce at the local market. It was a reminder that this land had history and purpose long before Patricia Henderson and her HOA showed up. The next week, Jake sent his response to the HOA's attorney. It was a masterpiece of legal writing, polite but firm, laying out exactly why their claims had no merit and warning that continued harassment would result in legal consequences for them. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I was served with a lawsuit. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA was taking me to court, claiming that my livestock operation was a public nuisance, that it violated county health codes, and that my property was causing a decrease in surrounding property values. They were seeking an injunction to force me to remove the animals, plus damages of $50,000. I sat in Jake's office again, this time feeling less confident. "Can they do this?" "They can file a lawsuit, sure," Jake said, reading through the complaint. "But winning it is another matter. This is a nuisance claim combined with some creative interpretations of county ordinances. None of it is going to hold up, but it means we have to go through the legal process." "How long will that take?" "Probably 6 months to a year, depending on the court schedule. The good news is that I am very confident we will win. The bad news is that it is going to cost you some money in legal fees and it is going to be stressful." "What about countersuing?" "We can absolutely do that. Once we get this dismissed, we can file a claim for malicious prosecution, abuse of process, and harassment. We might also be able to go after them for your legal fees." I agreed to move forward. Jake filed our response, denying all of the HOA's claims and asserting that my property was legally zoned for agricultural use, and that I had every right to keep livestock. We also filed a counterclaim for harassment and requested that the court award us attorney fees. The preliminary hearing was set for January, which gave me a few months to prepare. During that time, Patricia ramped up her campaign against me. She started a petition among the HOA members to protect property values from agricultural encroachment. She posted on the neighborhood Facebook page, sharing photos of my chickens and goats with captions like, "Is this what we want our community to become?" And "One person's hobby farm is destroying our property values." Some of her neighbors ate it up, posting comments about how my animals were noisy and smelly and how I was being selfish. But others pushed back, pointing out that my property was well maintained, that my animals were not causing any actual problems, and that the HOA had no legal authority over my land. The Facebook page turned into a battleground, with arguments stretching on for hundreds of comments. One evening in late November, I was out feeding the goats when a county health inspector showed up. He was a middle-aged guy named Dennis Porter, wearing a county uniform and carrying a clipboard. "Evening, sir," he said. "I am here to conduct an inspection of your property. We received a complaint about unsanitary conditions related to livestock." "Let me guess. Patricia Henderson filed the complaint," I said. Dennis gave me a sympathetic look. "I cannot disclose who filed the complaint, but I do need to conduct an inspection." "Go ahead," I said, gesturing to the property. "I've got nothing to hide." Dennis spent about 30 minutes looking at the chicken coop, the goat pen, the feed storage area, and my general property maintenance. He took photos, made notes, and asked me questions about my feeding schedule, waste disposal, and veterinary care. Finally, he closed his clipboard and said, "Everything looks good here. Your animals are healthy, your facilities are clean, and you are well within compliance for a small-scale agricultural operation. I will file a report saying no violations were found." "Thank you," I said, relieved. "Just between you and me," Dennis added quietly, "we get these complaints from HOAs all the time. They try to use county enforcement as a weapon against people they do not like. It is a waste of our resources, and it is usually baseless. Good luck with whatever is going on here." After he left, I called Jake and told him about the inspection. He laughed. "That is perfect. Their own complaint just generated evidence that you are running a clean, legal operation. I will make sure to include the inspector's report in our filings." December came, and with it, more escalation. Patricia convinced the HOA board to hire a second attorney, someone who specialized in land use law. They filed an amended complaint adding more claims, including allegations that my rooster's crowing constituted a noise violation and that my property was attracting vermin. The rooster crowing claim was particularly absurd. I had one rooster, and he crowed at dawn, like roosters do. We were in a rural area, surrounded by farmland until the development came in. If someone moved next to a farm and then complained about farm noises, that was their problem, not mine. The vermin claim was equally ridiculous. Jake helped me hire a pest control expert who came out and inspected the property. His report stated that my property showed no signs of unusual rodent activity and that my feed storage practices were appropriate and secure. As the court date approached, I started to feel the strain. The legal process was exhausting, and even though Jake was confident, there was always a nagging worry in the back of my mind. What if the judge sided with the HOA? What if I lost my animals, my property rights, everything my family had built on this land? Emily Grant, a reporter from the local newspaper, the Madison County Register, reached out to me in mid-December. She had heard about the case and wanted to write a story. I was hesitant at first, but Jake thought it might be good to get public opinion on our side. Emily came out to the property on a cold Saturday morning. She was in her early 30s, sharp and professional, with a notebook full of questions. "So, Thomas, tell me how this all started." I walked her through everything, from Patricia's first complaint to the lawsuit. Emily took notes, asked follow-up questions, and spent time photographing the property. She met Hank and Dolly, who were happy to pose for pictures, and she even collected a few fresh eggs from the chicken coop. "This is a great human interest story," Emily said as we wrapped up. Small property owner standing up to an overreaching HOA, defending his family's agricultural legacy. "People love this stuff." "I just want to keep my animals and live in peace," I said. "That is what makes it a good story," Emily replied with a smile. Her article ran the following week, right on the front page of the local section. The headline read, "Longtime agricultural property faces HOA lawsuit despite predating development." The article was fair and well-researched, laying out both sides but clearly showing that the law was on my side. It included quotes from Jake, from the county inspector, and even from Robert Chen, who spoke about the area's farming history. The response was immediate. The newspaper's website was flooded with comments, most of them supportive. People shared the article on social media, and it started gaining traction beyond just Madison County. A few regional news outlets picked up the story, and suddenly, I was getting calls from reporters in Nashville, Memphis, and even from a television station in Knoxville. Patricia, meanwhile, was furious. She posted a long rant on the HOA Facebook page, claiming the media was biased and that I was manipulating public opinion. She insisted the HOA was fighting for the rights of all homeowners and that my farm was a threat to the community. The January hearing arrived, and I met Jake at the courthouse in Jackson, Tennessee. It was a cold, gray morning, and the building was busy with people coming and going for various court matters. The HOA showed up in force. Patricia, 3 other board members and both of their attorneys, Marcus Webb and the new land use specialist, a woman named Sharon Foster. We were in a smaller courtroom, and the judge was a stern-looking man in his 60s named Judge Richard Coleman. He had a reputation for being no-nonsense and efficient, which Jake said was good for us. The HOA's attorneys went first, presenting their case. Marcus Webb stood up and launched into a long argument about community standards, property values, and the importance of HOA regulations. He showed photos of my property, emphasizing the animals and claiming they were incompatible with a modern residential neighborhood. Sharon Foster followed up with the land use arguments, claiming that even though my property was zoned agricultural, the surrounding development created a new context that should limit my rights. She cited cases where courts had restricted agricultural activities in areas that had become more residential. Judge Coleman listened without much expression, occasionally taking notes. When they finished, he looked at Jake and said, "Counselor, your response." Jake stood up, and I could see the confidence in his posture. "Your Honor, this case is straightforward. My client's property has been zoned for agricultural use since 1942, decades before the plaintiff HOA even existed. The property is not part of the HOA, was never part of the HOA, and was specifically excluded from the HOA plat map when the development was approved. The plaintiffs have no legal standing to enforce their rules on my client's property." He walked over to the table and picked up a stack of documents. "I have here the original zoning records from 1942, the county plat map showing the development boundaries, and my client's property deed, which makes no mention of any HOA affiliation. I also have inspection reports from the county health department and a licensed pest control expert, both confirming that my client's property is clean, well-maintained, and in full compliance with all applicable laws." Jake placed the documents in front of the judge and continued. "The plaintiffs claim my client's livestock constitutes a nuisance, but they have provided no credible evidence of any actual harm. A rooster crowing at dawn is not a nuisance. It is normal farm activity on legally zoned agricultural land. The plaintiffs also claim property value impacts, but they have provided no appraisals, no market analysis, no actual evidence that my client's property has affected theirs in any measurable way." Judge Coleman picked up the documents and started reviewing them. The courtroom was silent except for the rustling of paper. After several minutes, he looked up and said, "Miss Foster, can you explain to me why your client believes they have standing to sue over a property that is not part of their HOA?" Sharon Foster stood up, looking less confident now. "Your Honor, our position is that the presence of farm animals in what has become a residential area creates a nuisance regardless of the property's HOA status. We are basing our claim on public nuisance law, not on HOA enforcement. But your complaint specifically cites HOA bylaws and requests enforcement of those bylaws," Judge Coleman said, flipping through the pages. "You cannot have it both ways, Counselor. Either this is an HOA enforcement action, in which case you need to establish that the defendant is actually part of your HOA, or it is a nuisance claim, in which case you need to prove actual harm." "We believe we can prove both, Your Honor," Sharon said, but her voice lacked conviction. Judge Coleman set the documents down and leaned back in his chair. "Here is my preliminary assessment. The defendant's property is clearly zoned agricultural and has been for over 80 years. The property was specifically excluded from the HOA boundaries, which the plaintiff's own development documents confirm. The defendant has provided evidence that his operation is clean, legal, and compliant with all county regulations. The plaintiffs, meanwhile, have provided mostly speculation and concern about property values, with no actual evidence of harm." He paused, looking directly at Patricia and the HOA attorneys. "I am going to give you 30 days to either provide compelling evidence of actual, measurable harm caused by the defendant's livestock, or to withdraw this lawsuit. If you cannot provide that evidence, I will dismiss this case with prejudice and consider the defendant's request for attorney fees." "Are we clear?" Marcus Webb and Sharon Foster exchanged glances. "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus said finally. "Good. We will reconvene in 30 days. Court is adjourned." As we left the courtroom, Jake was grinning. "That went even better than I expected. Coleman basically told them they have no case." "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now they have to decide if they want to keep digging themselves deeper or if they want to cut their losses. My guess is they will try to find some expert to back up their property value claims, but that is going to cost them a lot of money, and it probably will not work anyway." We walked out of the courthouse into the cold January air. Patricia and her group were clustered near the parking lot, having what looked like a heated discussion. She saw me and shot me a glare that could have melted steel. Over the next few weeks, I tried to get back to normal life. I kept up with the farm chores, went to work at my job as a project manager for a construction company, and did my best not to obsess over the lawsuit. But it was hard not to think about it, especially when Patricia continued her campaign on social media. She started posting daily updates on the HOA Facebook page, framing the lawsuit as a fight for the soul of the community. She organized a meeting where she invited a real estate agent to speak about how non-conforming properties could impact home values. The agent gave a generic presentation about curb appeal and neighborhood consistency, carefully avoiding any specific claims about my property. But the tide of public opinion was turning against the HOA. More articles came out, including a piece in the Nashville Tennessean that portrayed the lawsuit as an example of HOA overreach. Online forums and social media groups picked up the story, and I started receiving messages of support from people all over the state. One message that stood out came from a woman named Susan Talbot, who had been through a similar fight with her HOA in Knoxville. "Do not give up," she wrote. "These people count on you being too tired or too broke to fight back, but you are doing the right thing and you are going to win." The 30 days passed, and we returned to court in early February. This time, the HOA came prepared with an expert witness, a real estate appraiser named Gregory Mills. He took the stand and testified that properties near agricultural operations typically sell for 5 to 10% less than comparable properties in purely residential areas. Jake Cross examined him methodically. "Mr. Mills, have you conducted a specific appraisal of the properties surrounding my client's land?" "No, I have not," Gregory admitted. "Have you analyzed actual sales data from the Meadowbrook Estates neighborhood?" "I have reviewed some general data from the area, but not specific to this neighborhood or my client's property." "Not specifically, no." Jake pulled out a document. "I have here sales data from Meadowbrook Estates over the past 3 years. Home values have increased by an average of 8%, which is consistent with regional trends." "Can you explain how my client's property is causing harm when the actual data shows healthy appreciation?" Gregory hesitated. "Well, the values might have increased more without the agricultural property." "Might have. So you are speculating." "I am providing professional opinion based on general market trends. But you have no specific evidence that my client's property has harmed anyone's home value." "Not specific evidence, no." Jake let that answer hang in the air for a moment before sitting down. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Coleman called for closing arguments. Marcus Webb made one last attempt to salvage the case, arguing that community standards should be given weight and that the HOA had a legitimate interest in maintaining neighborhood character. Jake responded by pointing out that community standards could not override legal property rights, and that the HOA's interests did not extend to property, that was not part of their association. Judge Coleman took less than 10 minutes to make his decision. I have reviewed all the evidence and heard the testimony. The plaintiffs have failed to demonstrate that the defendant's property is part of their HOA, failed to prove any actual nuisance, and failed to provide credible evidence of harm. The defendant's property is legally zoned for agricultural use and has been for over 80 years. His operation is clean, compliant with all regulations, and represents a legitimate use of his property rights. He looked directly at the HOA's table. This lawsuit should never have been filed. It is clear to me that this is an attempt to use the legal system to force compliance where the plaintiffs have no actual authority. Therefore, I am dismissing this case with prejudice. Furthermore, I am awarding attorney fees to the defendant to be paid by the plaintiffs. The clerk will set a hearing to determine the amount of those fees. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Patricia's face went bright red, and she started arguing with Marcus Webb in a harsh whisper. Jake squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "We won." As we left the courthouse, a small group of reporters was waiting. Emily Grant was there, along with a television crew from Nashville. They asked me how I felt about the verdict. "I am relieved," I said honestly. "This was never about being difficult or causing problems. I just wanted to keep my animals and honor my family's history on this land. I am glad the judge understood that property rights matter." "What message do you have for the HOA?" another reporter asked. I thought carefully before answering. "I hope they learn that you cannot bully people just because you do not like what they are doing. If someone is following the law and not hurting anyone, leave them alone." The story of my victory spread quickly. The local news ran it that evening, and by the next morning it was being discussed on regional talk radio. The narrative was clear. Small property owner defeats overreaching HOA, stands up for property rights and family legacy. But the story was not quite over. A week after the verdict, Jake called me with news. "Thomas, we need to talk about something serious. I have been going through the HOA's financial records as part of the fee determination process, and I found something concerning." "What is it?" I asked. "Patricia and the HOA board spent over $70,000 on this lawsuit. That money came from the HOA's reserve fund, which is supposed to be used for community maintenance and emergencies. They never got approval from the general membership, and they used it to fund a personal vendetta. Is that illegal?" "It is at minimum a breach of fiduciary duty, possibly fraud. The HOA members could sue the board members personally for misusing association funds. And if the board members knowingly misrepresented the situation to get approval for the spending, it could be criminal." "What should I do?" "Nothing for now. But I am going to make sure this information gets into the right hands. The HOA members deserve to know how their money was spent." Jake filed the information with the court as part of our fee petition, and he also sent a letter to the HOA membership outlining what had happened. The response was explosive. HOA members started showing up at board meetings demanding answers. How could Patricia spend $70,000 without approval? Why had they pursued such an obviously flawed lawsuit? Who was going to pay for the attorney fees we were awarded? Patricia tried to defend herself at a contentious meeting in late February. According to Robert Chen, who attended, she claimed the lawsuit was necessary to protect the community and that the board had acted in good faith. But the members were not buying it. They voted to remove Patricia and 2 other board members from their positions and initiated an investigation into the financial irregularities. The new board president, a reasonable guy named Michael Torres, reached out to me directly. "Thomas, I want to apologize on behalf of the HOA. What happened to you was wrong and it should never have gotten this far. We are going to do everything we can to make this right." "I appreciate that," I said. "I never had a problem with the HOA or the neighborhood. I just wanted to be left alone to live my life." "Understood. And for what it is worth, I think your property is great. My kids love seeing the goats when we drive past." The attorney fee hearing happened in March. Jake presented documentation showing he had spent over 40 hours on the case, plus expenses for expert witnesses and filing fees. He requested $25,000, which Judge Coleman approved without hesitation. The HOA was required to pay me that amount within 60 days, but the legal consequences for Patricia were just beginning. Several HOA members filed a lawsuit against her, and the former board members for breach of fiduciary duty and misappropriation of funds. They were seeking to recover the money spent on the lawsuit against me, plus damages. Additionally, the Tennessee Attorney General's office opened an investigation into whether Patricia had committed fraud by misrepresenting the lawsuit to the HOA membership. She had apparently told members that the lawsuit was certain to succeed, and that I would be forced to pay their legal fees, neither of which was true. In April, I received my check for $25,000 from the HOA. Jake had already sent me his final bill, which was less than that amount because he had worked efficiently and had been confident in the outcome. I ended up ahead financially, which felt like justice. More importantly, I had my peace back. The new HOA board made it clear they had no interest in bothering me. Patricia had moved out of the neighborhood by May, unable to face the anger of her former neighbors. I heard through the grapevine that she was facing serious financial consequences from the lawsuits against her personally. In June, the Attorney General's office announced that Patricia Henderson had been charged with fraud and misappropriation of funds. She had allegedly falsified documents to make it appear that the HOA membership had approved the lawsuit spending when they had not. The criminal case was still pending, but it looked like she would face real consequences. Throughout all of this, life on the farm continued. I added 2 ducks to my little menagerie, and they took to the pond on the back edge of my property like they had always lived there. Hank and Dolly were as friendly as ever, and the chickens kept providing fresh eggs. I had planted a vegetable garden in the spring, honoring my grandfather's tradition of growing tomatoes, peppers, and squash. One Saturday in July, I was out working on expanding the chicken coop when Robert Chen came over with his grandson, a curious 6-year-old named Leo. "Thomas, Leo has been asking if he could see the animals. Would you mind?" "Not at all," I said, putting down my hammer. "Come on over, Leo." The boy's face lit up, and we spent the next hour walking around the property. Leo fed the goats, collected eggs from the chickens, and laughed when the ducks splashed in the pond. Robert and I sat on the porch, watching the kid explore. "You did a good thing standing up to them," Robert said quietly. "Not everyone has the courage to fight back." "I had good reasons to fight," I replied. "This land means something. It is not just a house or a piece of property. It is family history, a connection to the past. I was not going to let some HOA take that away. Your grandfather would be proud." I thought about that as I watched Leo chase the chickens around the yard. My grandfather had worked this land through the Depression, through World War II, through decades of change and progress. He had raised my father here, taught him the value of hard work and stewardship. My father had passed those lessons on to me. The land had changed around us. Where there used to be open fields and neighboring farms, there were now subdivisions and strip malls. But this 5 acres remained, a small reminder that the past still matters, that history and tradition have value, that not everything needs to be standardized and controlled by regulations and bylaws. In August, I got a call from Jake with final news. The civil lawsuit against Patricia and the board members settled. They are going to pay back the $70,000 to the HOA, plus damages. And Patricia took a plea deal on the criminal charges. She is getting probation, community service, and has to pay restitution. So it is finally over. It is finally over. You won, Thomas. Not just the lawsuit, but the whole fight. You protected your property, exposed corruption, and probably helped a lot of other people who were being bullied by that HOA. After we hung up, I walked out to the yard. The summer evening was warm, and fireflies were starting to appear in the fading light. The goats were bedded down in their shelter, the chickens were roosting, and the ducks were floating peacefully on the pond. Everything was exactly as it should be. I thought about how close I had come to losing all of this, how much effort it had taken to defend something that should never have been threatened in the first place. But I also thought about the support I had received from people like Jake, Robert, Emily, and countless others who believed in property rights and standing up to bullies. The story had resonated with people because it touched on something fundamental. The idea that your home is your castle, that you have the right to use your property as you see fit as long as you are not harming others, and that no organization should have the power to override those rights just because they disapprove of your choices. In September, Emily Grant wrote a follow-up article about the outcome of the case. It detailed Patricia's criminal conviction, the financial settlements, and the changes in the HOA leadership. She interviewed Michael Torres, who talked about implementing new oversight procedures to prevent future abuse of authority. She also interviewed me, and I talked about how important it was to know your rights and not be intimidated by threats. The article concluded with a photo of me standing in front of the barn, with Hank and Dolly visible in the background. The caption read, "Thomas Darrow on the family land that has been zoned agricultural since 1942, long before the surrounding neighborhood existed." That photo ended up being used in a national story about HOA conflicts that ran in USA Today. Suddenly, I was getting emails and messages from people all over the country who had their own HOA horror stories. Some had won their fights, others were still struggling, and many had simply given up and moved away. I responded to as many as I could, offering encouragement and, when appropriate, Jake's contact information for legal referrals. It felt good to know that my fight had maybe made it a little easier for others to stand up for themselves. By October, exactly 1 year after Patricia had first started complaining about my chickens, life had settled into a comfortable routine. The farm was thriving, my job was going well, and the neighborhood had accepted that I was there to stay. Some of the HOA members had even become friendly, stopping by occasionally to buy fresh eggs or just to chat. Michael Torres invited me to speak at an HOA meeting in late October, which I agreed to do. I stood in front of about 30 homeowners in the community clubhouse and told them my story. I explained the history of the property, the legal battle, and the importance of understanding property rights. "I never wanted to be at war with this neighborhood," I said. "I just wanted to live my life and honor my family's legacy. The previous board saw me as a problem to be eliminated, but the truth is, we can coexist just fine. My property does not hurt yours. Your neighborhood does not hurt my farm. We are all just trying to make a home in this community." The response was overwhelmingly positive. People thanked me for standing up to Patricia, for exposing the financial mismanagement, and for fighting for property rights that protected all of them, not just me. Several people asked questions about the legal process, and I was happy to share what I had learned. As I drove home that night, I felt a sense of closure. The fight was over, justice had been served, and life could move forward. The land that my grandfather had worked, that my father had preserved, and that I had defended was safe. It would remain agricultural, a working piece of land in the middle of suburban sprawl for as long as I owned it. I made a promise to myself that night. Someday, when I had kids of my own, I would teach them the same lessons my grandfather had taught my father, and my father had taught me. Hard work, stewardship, standing up for what is right, and never letting anyone take away what is yours just because they think they know better. The rooster crowed the next morning at 5, just like he always did. I made my coffee, walked out onto the porch, and looked out over my 5 acres of farm land. The chickens were already pecking around their run. The goats were stretching and starting their day. The ducks were gliding across the pond, leaving ripples in the still water. Somewhere in the neighborhood, people were probably sleeping in, enjoying their Saturday morning. Some might have been annoyed by the rooster, but they would have to get used to it, because this farm was not going anywhere. It had been here long before Meadowbrook Estates, and if I had anything to say about it, it would be here long after. The sun rose over the oak trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was going to be a beautiful day, and I had work to do. The fence on the south side needed repair, the vegetable garden needed weeding, and I wanted to start planning for spring planting. Life on the farm never stopped, and that was exactly how I liked it. As I finished my coffee and headed down to the barn, I thought about Patricia Henderson and where she might be now. Part of me felt sorry for her. She had let her desire for control and conformity turn into an obsession that cost her everything. Her reputation, her position, her money, and ultimately her freedom when the criminal charges came down. All because she could not accept that one small piece of land in her perfect neighborhood did not have to follow her rules. But mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful for the legal system that protected my rights. Grateful for Jake and his expertise. Grateful for the community members who supported me. Grateful for the journalists who told my story fairly. And grateful for my grandfather, who had the foresight to establish agricultural zoning on this land 80 years ago, creating a protection that I did not even know existed until I needed it. The fight with the HOA had been exhausting, expensive, and stressful, but it had also been educational, empowering, and ultimately victorious. I had learned that standing up for your rights is hard but necessary. I had learned that bullies often back down when confronted with facts and determination. And I had learned that sometimes the little guy really does win. As winter approached, I continued to make improvements to the property. I built a new storage shed for feed and equipment. I reinforced the barn against the cold weather. I even installed a small solar panel system to help with electricity costs, making the farm a little more sustainable and independent. In December, I received an unexpected visitor. A young couple, Sarah and Mark Patterson, pulled into my driveway and asked if they could talk to me. They were looking to buy property in the area and had heard about my situation with the HOA. "We want to buy land where we can keep some animals and have a big garden," Sarah explained. "But we are terrified of ending up in a situation like yours. How do we protect ourselves?" I invited them in and spent an hour going over everything I had learned. I explained the importance of checking zoning records, reviewing plat maps, and making sure any property you buy is either not part of an HOA or is in an HOA that explicitly allows what you want to do. I gave them Jake's contact information and encouraged them to have an attorney review everything before buying. "The key is to do your homework before you buy," I told them. "Once you own the property, it is a lot harder to fight." But if you know your rights and you choose the right property, you can avoid these problems entirely." They thanked me profusely and left with pages of notes. A few months later, I got a card from them saying they had found the perfect property, 10 acres in a different county with no HOA and clear agricultural zoning. They were planning to raise chickens, goats, and maybe a couple of pigs. The card included a photo of them standing in front of their new barn, smiling broadly. That card went up on my refrigerator, a reminder that my fight had helped others avoid the same battle. If nothing else came from the whole ordeal, that was enough. Spring came again, and with it, new life on the farm. 2 of my chickens hatched clutches of chicks, filling the yard with fluffy yellow babies. Dolly had twins, 2 adorable little goats that bounced around like they were on springs. The ducks laid eggs in a hidden nest by the pond. And one morning I discovered a line of tiny ducklings paddling along behind their mother. The farm was thriving, growing, continuing the cycle that my grandfather had started so many decades ago. The land was fulfilling its purpose, producing food, supporting life, connecting me to the natural world and to my family history. Robert Chen came over one evening in May, and we sat on the porch watching the sun set. "You know, Thomas, I have lived in this area for 25 years. I have seen a lot of changes. Farms turning into subdivisions, open space becoming parking lots, old families moving away. It makes me sad sometimes." "I can imagine," I said, "but your place gives me hope. You fought to preserve something important and you won. This little piece of land is going to remain a farm at least for a while longer. That matters. It really does." We sat in comfortable silence as the fireflies began their evening dance. Somewhere in the distance, I heard my rooster crow, even though it was not dawn. He did that sometimes, as if he was reminding the world that he was here, that this was his territory, that some things did not change just because the world around them did. In June, the 1-year anniversary of Patricia's conviction, I decided to host a small gathering. I invited Robert and his family, Michael Torres and his wife, Jake and his family, Emily Grant, and a few other neighbors who had supported me through the ordeal. We had a barbecue in the yard, and I gave tours of the farm to anyone who was interested. Jake's kids, 2 boys aged 8 and 10, were fascinated by everything. They helped me feed the animals, collected eggs, and spent a solid hour playing with the baby goats. Watching their excitement reminded me why all of this mattered. Kids need to know where food comes from, to understand that milk does not just appear in cartons and eggs do not originate in cardboard boxes. They need to experience the connection between land, animals, and the food on their table. As the evening wound down and people started to leave, Jake pulled me aside. "You did something important, Thomas, not just for yourself, but for everyone who believes property rights matter. You stood up to institutional bullying and you won. Do not ever forget that." "I would not have won without you," I said, "maybe. But you had the courage to fight in the first place. A lot of people would have just given up, sold the property, walked away. You did not. That takes guts." After everyone left, I walked the property one more time as the stars came out. The goats were settled in their shelter, making soft, contented sounds. The chickens were roosted, silent in the darkness. The ducks were somewhere on the pond, safe in their little floating world. This was my land, my farm, my legacy. I had fought for it, defended it, and won the right to keep it exactly as it was meant to be. The HOA had tried to take that away, but they had failed. The law had protected me, justice had prevailed, and life had continued. Standing there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the farm and the night, I felt a deep sense of peace. The battle was over. The farm was safe. And tomorrow, when the rooster crowed at dawn, I would get up and do it all again. Just like my grandfather had, just like my father would have, just like I would teach my own children to do someday. The land endures. The farm continues. And no HOA, no matter how determined or well-funded, could change that fundamental truth. This was agricultural land in 1942. It was agricultural land when I bought it in 2018, and it would remain agricultural land for as long as I had anything to say about it. As I walked back to the house, I made one more silent promise to my grandfather, wherever he was. I promised to keep this land working, to keep it productive, to keep it connected to its agricultural roots. I promised to stand up for it, to protect it, and to pass it on someday to someone who would value it as much as I did. The fight with the HOA had taught me many things, but the most important lesson was this. When you know you are right, when you have the law on your side, and when you are fighting for something that truly matters, you cannot give up. You have to stand your ground, face the opposition, and see it through to the end. I had done that. I had won. And now, finally, I could just enjoy the farm, the animals, and the life I had chosen for myself on this small piece of land that meant so much. The lights in the surrounding neighborhood twinkled in the darkness, each house representing a family, a life, a set of dreams. My house stood among them, different but compatible, agricultural in the midst of residential, a reminder that diversity and history have value. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new chores, new moments of joy and frustration that come with farm life. But it would also bring the satisfaction of meaningful work, the pleasure of caring for animals, and the deep contentment of living in harmony with the land. I went inside, tired but happy, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. The rooster would crow at dawn. The animals would need feeding. The farm would continue its rhythms, unchanged and unchanging, a small island of agricultural tradition in a sea of suburban conformity. And that, I thought as I finally climbed into bed, was exactly as it should be. The land had been here before the HOA, and it would be here long after. Some things, the important things, endure. My 5 acres of farmland in Madison County, Tennessee, was one of those things. And now, thanks to standing up for my rights and fighting the good fight, it always would be.